Hello and welcome to the Friday, November 6th, 2020. Alleluia, it's almost over, or isn't, edition of On Iowa Politics. This week, the election and what's ahead. Hi, I'm James Lynch of the Cedar Rapids Gazette. With me today are Bret Hayworth of the Sioux City Journal. Good morning, Bret.
Good morning.
Tom Barton of the Quad City Times. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Amie Rivers of the Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, James.
Erin Murphy, Lee newspaper Statehouse bureau chief. Good morning, Erin.
Good morning, James.
And Gazette opinion editor Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
You can find us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to On Iowa Politics on iTunes and Stitcher. The big story this week, of course, was the election. There were some results. We may or may not know who our next president will be for months. Who knows? But in Iowa, we got the counting done, except for the too close to call second district race, where the lead now has flipped to Rita Hart over Marionette Miller-Meeks. So, Todd, as you look at the results, what's the big story, the big takeaway from Tuesday?
Well, I think it's clear the big story, in Iowa is that Republicans did very well, better than expected, or at least, far better than what Democrats were hoping. They took a beating in 2016, bounced back a little bit in 2018. I think they were hoping to sort of make enough gains that this would become sort of the purple swing state that it used to be. But they lost the big prize, the Senate race, and they thought they could knock off Joni Ernst, but that didn't happen. They thought that they could maybe take control of the Iowa House. Instead, the Republican majority is even larger, and the Democrats lost seats. They didn't dent the Senate, and they, lost incumbent Abby Finkenauer, lost her congressional seat. And Rita Hart running to take over Dave Loebsack's seat, a Democratic seat. That's still up in the air. Hart leading slightly, but very slightly. So it was a good night for Republicans. Democrats are disappointed and sort of looking at the ruby red map, wondering where they go from here.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Abby Finkenauer lost her U.S. House seat, which I think was a surprise. We expected that to be competitive. I was struck there that by the turnout numbers, which you would expect to be higher in a presidential election, and I think the turnout was like 24% higher than 2 years ago, and Finkenauer increased her vote total by 18%, but Ashley Hinson increased the Republican votes by almost 38%. So it was a real swing there in that first district. And I think one of the keys was that Hinson was able to keep it close enough in Lynn County. And she won like 49% of the vote in Dubuque County, which we used to call a Democratic stronghold. I'm not sure what's happening there, but and Amie, I know you were watching those first district results, and any thoughts on how or why Hinson was able to make it closer in the cities?
You hit on it. It's Dubuque County. If you're looking at 2018, that was the reason that Finkenauer won over Blum. She was able to post bigger gains in Dubuque County. And this year, Dubuque didn't even go for the Democratic presidential candidate. They barely went for Finkenauer, which tells me that there were actually some split votes that voted Biden or voted Trump, but then also voted Finkenauer. So, but not enough. Like it was like, I'm looking at the Secretary of State's website. It's a differential of not even 300 votes in Dubuque County. And that was really what she needed. If she had taken Dubuque County by a lot and then not taken too many more votes off of the smaller counties, I think she could have pulled off a win. But as it stands, Hinson really was dominant in all of the counties that weren't named Blackhawk, Lynn, and Dubuque. So, I mean, basically, Hinson was making these margins in these smaller counties. And I think was sort of riding on, as you said, that overwhelming Republican push to the polls that really propelled her to victory.
Moving from Dubuque to Cedar Rapids was not a strategic move for Finkenauer, I guess.
Apparently not. Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, I think there was a similar thing happened in the second district with Miller Meeks significantly increasing Republican votes in those rural counties to keep it. She lost in Johnson County by like 2-1, which is expected for any Republican. But that race isn't over. New development this morning or late last night. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we did have some news on that front this morning. Democrat Rita Hart has now overtaken Republican Marionette Miller Meeks in unofficial results posted to the Iowa Secretary of State's website. With one precinct in the district, I guess, rerunning its absentee ballots today after local election officials noticed a discrepancy. So yeah, the Secretary of State's website today shows Rita Hart leading Marionette Miller Meeks by 162 votes. So I mean, it's still super close, razor thin. That's a flip from yesterday on Thursday. Miller Meeks held a 282 vote lead out of about 394,000 votes cast in that race. But yeah, you're right. We saw similarities in the second district race that was seen in the first district race. Miller Meeks, ran up the score in rural counties, flipping counties that voted for President Donald Trump, but backed the current 7-term Democratic incumbent Dave Loebsack in 2016, who's retiring. And cutting into Hart's margin of victory in the three large, traditionally kind of Democratic counties that she won of Scott, Clinton, and Johnson. While Rita Hart took about 70% of the vote in heavily Democratic Johnson County, Miller Meeks actually outperformed the presidents in that county by a few points. And this is one of 31 House districts that Trump won in 2016 that is represented by a Democrat in 2020. And 5 of the 7 counties that voted for Trump but backed Loebsack in 2016, it looks like, swung for Miller Meeks, according to unofficial results. And the president drove turnout in Iowa, according to the Iowa Secretary of State. It seems like that lifted Republicans up across the board down ballot in kind of this red wave where the GOP unseated a first-term Iowa Democratic Congresswoman, and depending on how things go in the second district race, Republicans could gain a 3-1 majority in Iowa's 4 congressional seats, and also, of course, they increased their advantage in the Iowa legislature, and then reelected Republican Joni Ernst to the Senate.
Erin, we didn't see quite the same thing happen in the third district where David Young couldn't get enough votes in those rural counties to offset Representative Cindy Axne's margin in Polk County. I gathering that wasn't a surprise in that race.
It wasn't necessarily a surprise. It turned out similar. Maybe just the noteworthy thing is that David Young made that outcome just a hair closer. It was a 2-point win for Cindy Axne 2 years ago, and it was just a little over a 1-point win this year. So David Young did kind of tighten things up a little bit and got a little closer, but ultimately Axne again just held on and in a similar method by driving up her margins in Polk County and doing just enough in the other counties to hang on and avoid being overtaken there by David Young. So yeah, very, very similar. The campaign was very similar. We basically had a repeat debate cycle and issue discussion in the campaign, and ultimately the results were very similar to 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And Brett, over in the 4th district, I guess there was no surprise. State Senator Randy Feenstra captured something like 62% of the vote, which I think puts him in league with Senator Chuck Grassley. Was this the same old for the 4th, or was there any good news for Democrats?
Boy, I don't see any really good news for Democrats. That was back to a margin like Steve King used to have in the old fifth back in the 2000s and early 2010s when he was winning a lot of seats and before things kind of tightened the last few election cycles. But no, so J.D. Scholten was the Democrat from Sioux City who lost to Randy Feenstra, the state senator from Hull. And 2 years ago, Scholten lost to King by only 3%. It was about 10,000 votes differential. And in that election, Scholten won 6 of the 39 counties, which is not a lot of counties to win, but they were it was the 5 highest population counties in the 4th districts. And this time he simply won, which was Story County, which is, home to Ames and Iowa State University. So, so he was pretty much wiped out, district wide there. And when I talked to him on, I guess it was about 11:30 on Tuesday night, election night, he was very astonished. He was, he said he felt good going into Monday and, had campaigned hard. And he really had campaigned hard. He did a lot of public events and went through all the towns and he just got swamped. And he said, the places I won the places I did strongly last time, I, just fell off the map. And so it was, definitely a Republican wave, and as you would expect, the tip-top Northwest counties like Lyon and Sioux, it was just astronomically high votes for Randy Feenstra, which is pretty much where his state senate district is up there, and
Sure.
Just not good news.
Well, I think it just drives home the fact too that the 2018 race was a referendum on Steve King, and even though Steve King won, there was a lot of dissatisfaction even among Republicans with him. That this year with a different Republican, those folks came home, I guess, for Randy Feenstra.
Right. There was all kinds of speculation, James, as you know, that basically once the primary went to Feenstra, that the race was over, so to speak.
Yeah. Exactly. Northwest Iowa seems to be sort of like Johnson County is for Democrats. J.D. Scholten posted on Twitter sort of an interesting tweet about how he would like to shape the Democratic Party. Should we read anything into that, Bret?
I don't know. Perhaps he's been very he relished the fact that he was spoken a way that a lot of Democrats don't speak. He didn't want to be a top down, what the national party wanted him to do, national leaders wanted him to do. And working this district, you have to be a moderate Democrat. That's the only way you can make inroads. But he talked about basically pocketbook or, individual family type issues, and that were that would resonate. And he has a lot of problems with how some of these top down race, how they want to just spend money and whatever the messaging. He wanted to be his own candidate, and I think there was an authenticity there that a lot of certainly for Democrats they like that, and I could see him taking another step as a candidate again.
Well, we'll keep an eye on him, and we'll also keep an eye on the Iowa legislature, where the Republican trifecta continues, actually grew, as Erin mentioned. So what do we know about Iowa Republicans and what they are going to do now that they've maintained control in the Iowa House? Democrats thought they had a real shot at flipping control. They needed 4 seats. Instead, they lost seats. Republicans increased their advantage from 53-47 to 59-41, which is the largest margin in at least 10 years, I think, and perhaps longer. Erin, you wrote about the legislative results. Any thoughts on what happened to Democrats?
I think there's a couple of things that went on here. One is just the turnout machine, I think, lifted all Republican votes in Iowa. So we talked, and you talked about turnout, James, in the first district, and it was way up in the Senate race. It was way up in the presidential race, and I think that helped Republicans all the way down the ballot. And then I think there's some discussion taking place, and we actually touched on this in podcast before the election too. So this should come as no surprise to our loyal listeners here. But Democrats didn't go out and knock on doors as much during the summer during the pandemic as Republicans did. Republicans felt there was a way to do that safely. And they went out and did that, and Democrats were more hesitant to do that and didn't do that until late. And there's a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle who feel that made a huge difference in this, especially these Statehouse races, some of which were only decided by a couple hundred votes or so. So I think those are the two things that look Democrats. Had very real hopes, and they were legitimate. I mean, they weren't pie in the sky dreams. You looked at it analytically, and there were reasons to believe that Democrats could have flipped some of those seats and flipped control of the chamber, but the exact opposite happened, and it was basically a best case scenario for type of performance for Republicans. They really cleaned up.
So, I mean, Republicans won in places they typically don't. Southern Lee County, for example, is one of the seats they picked up. They flipped there. They held on to a Des Moines County seat that they flipped 4 years ago. And they even won back some suburban seats. And I think one of those was sort of in your backyard, Erin, Heather Manson, who won 2 years ago, defeated a Republican 2 years ago, lost her election. Were there specific issues there, or was it just the Trump turnout?
Yeah, I think there might have been a little bit of both, depending on the different types of seats you just described. Those Southeast Iowa ones, Southern Iowa. I was talking to Pat Grassley this week, and he noted those, and he said that those were the kind of seats that maybe the top of the ticket presented an opening for Republican Statehouse candidates there, because Donald Trump has flipped those. That's in the Obama-Trump territory, those counties. And so voters' behaviors have changed in those areas at the top of the ticket. And Pat Grassley said that probably gave our candidates down the ticket an opening there, that these Republicans are more open to listening to the Republican at the top of the ticket. Maybe they're now more open to listening to Republicans at the Statehouse level too. And then the suburban seats, I think that's where you saw the door knocking really come into role. And there were some local issues too. Look, I can't verify this. It's such a tough thing to do. And I don't think we have exit polling at the Statehouse level to look at. But I have heard a couple people tell me that, and I know all about this. I could spend a whole podcast talking about this issue as a resident of Ankeny and a parent with my daughter in the school district, that the whole back to school plan here in Ankeny has been a very contentious thing, and it sounds like maybe that issue seeped into that Statehouse race, and Republicans feel like that's why they were successful in Ankeny specifically, was that they sided with the Republican candidates sided with the parents who are upset with the school district for not going back to full in-person learning. As of right now, the K-5 kids are all back, but the older kids are staggered, kind of in a hybrid mode. So it's possible, apparently, that a local issue played a factor in that race as well.
Yeah, another race that we were keeping an eye on was up in House 55, where Michael Bergen was running for re-election, and Democrat Kayla Cater who challenged him 2 years ago and lost when late arriving mail-in ballots were tossed out. We looked like she would have a good shot of winning that race, and yet she lost by I think it was around 1,400 votes. And what I've heard from folks up there is that when Decorah approved a mask mandate that became an issue in that race and hurt Cater's chances of winning a seat in the Iowa House. So, Tom, we talked earlier about some Quad City Republicans who were thought to be at risk, but no one was thrown out by the voters. Were they? I think all the Republicans were reelected, and I don't think there were any changes at all, were there?
No, you're right. Yeah. So Republicans dashed Democrats' efforts to flip 2 Scott County seats in their attempt to try and regain a majority of the Iowa House. So Republican incumbent Ross Postrian of Walcott held on to his Iowa House District 92 seat against a challenge from first-time candidate and Democrat Jennifer Kakert of Bluegrass, and Republican incumbent Gary Moore of Bettendorf retained his Iowa House District 94 seat, defeating Democrat Murray Gleason of Pleasant Valley. Both won, I believe, according to unofficial results, by, I think, double-digit margins of 11 or 12 percentage points.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Bret, I take it there were no surprises over there in your territory?
Right. Right. In the rural, there were a lot of Republicans who were running without any opposition whatsoever in the kind of the hinterlands, and but then there was a few competitive races where I think there was 4 where a Democrat opposed a Republican, and Republicans won all those. But in Sioux City, and then there was no surprise in Sioux City, which was the 2 Democratic-leaning districts within the city went for Democrats. Chris Hall won re-election, and then Steve Hansen, who some people would remember, who was a legislator for about 18 years back in the 80s and 90s. He has come back and won to go back into one of the chambers. And I did want to bring up, James, how I was struck. We were talking a little bit at the beginning about whether, Iowa's no longer purple. Absolutely, Woodbury County is no longer purple. That's been going for a few election cycles, in the same way that I believe that Iowa is not purple looking at things. So those 2 House districts that I mentioned where the Democrats won in Sioux City within Woodbury County, that's expected. But the larger lesson was that we had Woodbury County supervisor positions that were up. And in every case, and there were some pretty competitive Democrats that were running in 3 of those. And in every case, the Republicans won. The difference is that the Woodbury County, those positions are voted on countywide, regardless. They're districted, but all county voters can vote. And that just shows how Republicans are in Woodbury County are taking over. It's the last 6, 8, 4 years. That's just kind of been the trend. And I wanted to throw out just kind of the Gini demographic. I know this is on Iowa politics, but I also cover South Dakota, and we have a few districts in Southeast South Dakota that I cover. And when I started, Vermilion, which is home to the University of South Dakota, about 30 miles from Sioux City, was always heavily Democratic, and there always would be any the Statehouse districts would always go to a Democrat, and that has flipped also. Yankton, about 60 miles from Sioux City, that was always very like a union town, very Democratic, also now Republican. So really just, not just Iowa, but kind of seeping over what we consider Siouxland into, the other states, also becoming more and more Republican.
Mm-hmm. Across the Midwest, yeah. On the campaign trail, I heard Senator Chuck Grassley more than once talking about electing Republicans to the Statehouse to make sure that Democrats couldn't do to Governor Kim Reynolds what Pelosi and House Democrats are doing to President Donald Trump. So, Todd, what should we expect from the legislature with a bigger GOP trifecta?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the public campaigns that ran this fall were pretty substance free. At least in our neck of the woods, Republican candidates didn't go to forums or editorial boards or places where they could be sort of asked what their agenda was going to be, or ask some specifics on what their plans are. So it's anyone's guess. We know there will be surprises that sort of come from come from the conservative playbook, that pages that we hadn't yet flipped. And yeah, I think there's going to be, an appetite for more tax cuts depending on how the coronavirus economy works out. And I mean, with regard to the pandemic, the governor is saying that the election is a vindication of her approach to controlling, or I guess not controlling, the pandemic. So I don't expect that the legislature is going to come back and push her to uh, change policies or do more, no matter how bad it gets this winter. They're sort of committed to the live with it, or in some cases die with it, and that's where we're going to stay. So yeah, it's anyone's guess. There are lots of issues to address, conservative issues, as I say, tax cuts. The governor wants to bring back up her plan to raise the sales tax and provide mental health money and fill the environmental trust fund, but that didn't get a lot of traction last session, and I'm not sure with more Republicans that makes it easier. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of guessing what they're going to do, because they have a history of sort of putting stuff together and then springing it on us.
I'm wondering if we're entering sort of another era of Republican control, where the Republican governor, and the Republican legislature are at odds to some degree. I mean, you mentioned raising the sales tax for mental health funding and outdoor recreation and water quality. The governor wants a constitutional amendment to restore felon voting rights. There was sort of mixed support from Republicans on that. I mean, we tend to think that when you have a trifecta, when one party control, they get everything they want, but it looks like that may not be the case.
Well, and big majorities are harder to manage for leadership than small majorities. If you've only got 51 seats, then you need to have discipline. Everybody needs to be on board. You all need to be together. Now with 59 seats, there's a chance you're going to have some folks, kind of buck the team and want to do their own thing. And sometimes those can be more unwieldy. But as we've seen in recent years, they've basically pushed ahead with their agenda and haven't let anything slow them down.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out in January. Erin, as we've seen from the maps since Tuesday, there was a real urban-rural divide in the way Iowans voted. And I think as we've watched this develop over at least the past 10 years, we've tended to think that would favor cities, that they would have a stronger voice in Iowa politics. And maybe when we get the new census numbers, that will be the case. However, based on the results of this election, and seeing the Republican control, especially from the rural areas, will the next 2 years be the last best opportunity for rural interest, agribusiness, manufacturing, small towns to get their wishes, to get whatever agenda they have through the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it depends on those maps and what elections are going to look like and districts are going to look like for the next 10 years. So maybe they will feel a little bit of that urgency just because of the unknown. Now, we shouldn't expect anything too out of the crazy because of Iowa's redistricting system, which is hailed pretty widely as being nonpartisan. Of course, that's assuming that no changes come to that system over the next few months, but Republicans insist that's not in their plan. So we'll have to take them at their word until the rubber starts hitting the road here again in January. So I don't know that any changes of the map will be too dramatic as far as what it means for Iowa policy of really any kind going forward. I think just the bigger issue there is Democrats just clearly still have some work to do to figure out how to get their map expanded beyond 6 to 8 counties in Iowa. That's clearly not a winning formula on a statewide level. and that's something. And look, this didn't sneak up on them. We've been talking about that for a few cycles now. The shrinking map, the increasing urban-rural divide, and how that has hindered Iowa Democrats' efforts statewide in these races. So this isn't something that all of a sudden hit them in this election and they weren't ready for. This is something that we've been talking about. This is something that Democrats have been talking about, and so far nothing is changing. And this kind of circles all the way back to what Bret was talking about earlier with J.D. Scholten and whatever step he decides to take next. I'm sure he has some thoughts on what that discussion needs to sound like. So that's what's most interesting to me is kind of where do Democrats go from here, and how do they manage doing better in these statewide races outside of their biggest base areas, because obviously the strategy can no longer be to just drive up the vote totals in Des Moines and Ames and Waterloo and Iowa City and Davenport. They need more votes in those other areas too.
So we've talked about the heavy Republican turnout in rural Iowa, the urban-rural divide, and the GOP trifecta. But is any of that permanent? Amie, what does this election tell us about election 2022 or election 2024?
Yeah, I think Erin hit it on the head. He's talking about that rural-urban divide that's frankly been happening for decades. That sort of brain drain, they used to call it, and now it's the rural-urban divide. You're seeing young people moving to urban areas, and young people generally do vote more progressive if they vote at all. Next Gen made a huge get out the vote effort in this area, and it still only really moved the needle, I believe, like 1%. So I think maybe getting the young vote out more would be helpful if they can figure out how to do it. But I think you're right. Just not only figuring out a message that resonates with rural voters better, but sort of figuring out that messaging within the party as a whole, because this isn't just an Iowa phenomenon. This is happening around the country. You're seeing the urban areas become more heavily Democratic. You're seeing the rural areas become more heavily Republican, and a messaging thing needs to happen. And whether that's just making more appeals to people, whether that's putting somebody different at the top of the ticket, or whether that's trying to run a candidate that is a more populist candidate, like a Bernie Sanders, like the Republicans have been running a populist candidate in Trump. Possibly that, and those discussions have happened within the National Democratic Party. But there's such a sense of, if we run somebody like that, it could backfire, and we could have another thing. But I think they're really going to be taking a look at it this election, because Biden was not inspiring the enthusiasm, just as sort of Clinton wasn't inspiring the enthusiasm. Is it a messaging problem? Is it a candidate problem? You're really going to see a lot of hand-wringing, I think, over the next couple of months and years about that. And I think even more than that, really a clash in the Democratic Party.
Erin, in 2022, of course, there will be a governor's race, and Governor Reynolds said that this election sort of was an affirmation of her strategy on coronavirus, and hopefully we won't be debating coronavirus strategies in 2 years. But does this election give us any direction for 2022? Start to set that stage?
I think that's an open question, and my gut tells me that we're going to look back on this election as being somewhat unique. I don't know that we can look at what happened in 2020 and say with any certainty that a similar trends are going to continue into certainly 2022 in a midterm election, and maybe not even 2024 in the next presidential election. This was just such a unique election for so many reasons, between the polarizing incumbent president at the top of the ticket, the pandemic, and all the unique elements that brought in. I mean, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden is just going to be so different than whatever the election is 4 years from now. I think that I don't think we ignore what happened now. We'll all analyze what happened, and political science experts will do the same, and we'll talk to voters. But I don't think that this election is going to be predictive in too many ways of what's going to happen 2 and 4 years from now. I think those are going to be totally different elections with total different issues at the forefront, and I think we'll have to be careful about looking back too much, when we get around to the next election and say, well, this is what happened in 2020. So I just don't know that that's going to apply the way maybe has been a more traditionally the case as we look at previous elections as a way to inform future ones.
Bret, Tom, thoughts on whether or not this, like I said, sets the stage for 2022 and 2024?
Go ahead, Tom.
I think Erin nailed it. I think it's an open question, and I think that when all is said and done, we'll probably look back on 2020 and see this as kind of unique. I'm not exactly sure, what this portends for 2022 or 2024.
I want to bring up a name, I guess, James. And I think I mentioned this in June, right before the primary for the Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate seat, where Teresa Greenfield ultimately won. And Teresa Greenfield had been coronated, I guess is the word sometimes that is used, but she had been picked early on by the National Party leaders. And I keep wondering if for 2022, Mike Franken was a Democrat from Sioux City who came late in that race in 2019. And I kept watching the Ernst and Greenfield campaign play out the last few months and just saw the slew of ads. And it was so much about from the Republican side Republican side that what Greenfield would do with the Green New Deal. And it was a lot of that. But I just wondered how Mike Franken, who had Sioux County roots, and this goes back to what we were talking about of a new type of Democrat or a new type of Democratic messaging. I think that Mike Franken has that. He came from Sioux County. I would think certainly would be considered a moderate Democrat, but he did not win that primary. But he is the type of candidate, the things that he talked about, he seems to be one that could get inroads in these rural areas. I think back to when, who is he from Charles City? Was it Pritchard ran for?
Pritchard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember talking to him about how, because like he was, he's the rare non-polk or, or Lynn County kind of statewide office seeker. And he talked about how, he's from a town of a county seat town of 7, 8, 10,000. They need to do better with that. And anyway, I just keep thinking about those candidates, the messages that they have, and where they might go in 2022.
Sure.
As Democrats try to bounce back.
Todd, bring it home for us here. What's your prediction for 2022, 2024? We already have seen some of the 2024 Republicans coming in, or either in person or virtually, to support Republican candidates this cycle. What should we look for?
Yeah, well, all I know for sure is there definitely will be elections. Those are even-numbered years, and so that makes a lot of sense.
Not if Trump wins.
Well, that's looking less likely, but yeah, that's a good caveat. The governor's races are kind of funny, and this kind of lends into what Erin and others have said about not reading into too much into this year, looking at 2022. Kentucky has a Democratic governor, for instance. There are just it just seems like other issues with governors come up besides the sort of the partisan label. There's, I think, constituents, Iowans will, have a lot on their mind as far as performance, how she's done, where the state is in 2 years. I think the coronavirus handling, which is going to last well into next year, probably still be a concern as Democrats start to, jockey and raise money and get out trial balloons for possibly running. It'll still be an issue. So yeah, I expect that to be an interesting and potentially competitive race. I have no idea which Democrats are going to step out to do that. I mean, there's all sorts of speculation on, is Rob Sand priming himself to run for higher offices at the governorship or the Senate or one of those other, or some other office. But yeah, and presidential wise, it'll be, there are going to be folks that will probably encourage, Joni Ernst to think about that, which would be obviously an interesting wrinkle in Iowa and in the caucuses if she were to think about that. She was on the short list for Trump's running mates at one point, and so that's, I mean, everybody in the Senate gets to pretend to be a presidential candidate at one point and the other, I think. So, I mean, that's pretty well given.
I think it literally every Senate Democrat ran in this past cycle, right? Todd?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So it will be the Republicans' turn. I mean,
Well, if any of that happens, or even if it doesn't, we'll talk about it on a future edition of On Iowa Politics. But that's it for today. I hope it was worth your time. If you liked it, tell a friend. Otherwise, be quiet. You can subscribe to On Iowa Politics on iTunes or Stitcher and send your fan mail to podcast@thegazette.com. And you can find us on the homepages of the Quad City Times, Sioux City Journal, Muscatine Journal, Mason City Globe Gazette, Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier, and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Steven Kristopher will take us out. If you know an Iowa band or musician who should be on our show, send us a sound file and subscribe to On Iowa Politics. For Bret, Amie, Tom, Erin, Todd, and our producer, Steven, I'm James Lynch. Thanks for listening. Stay well.
Well, I lost my job, and I lost my girl, and so much more. Same old country song, it seems you've heard a million times before, but this one's different in a way that you can't see. It's about this ordinary man trying to be a better me, 'cause I'm holding on to a better view. I'm rolling with so much in front of me I gotta do, and I'm holding on to a place I call my own, and I'm letting go of everything I've ever known. I'm moving on, I'm driving down a brand new road, and I'm holding on to a place I call my own. Well, my new job's fine, and I sat down to write her a place I call my own, and I'm letting go of everything I've ever known. I'm moving on, driving down a brand new road, and I'm holding on. I'm holding on. I'm holding on to a place I call my own, and I'm letting go of everything I've ever known. I'm moving on, driving down a brand new road, and I'm holding on to a place I call my own. To a place I call my own.